Live ABC News coverage of this historic summit. President Biden, Russian President Vladimir Putin. This has been a fascinating and somewhat revealing afternoon already here, given what we've already heard from President Putin a short time ago. President Biden is now expected to come before the cameras at any moment. Putin revealing both countries have agreed to allow ambassadors to return. And on red lines, Putin said our American partners understood what we were saying. We understand what they were saying. Putin said they have agreed to negotiate and work on cybersecurity, on strategic stability, on regional conflicts. Putin saying, I think we can reach an agreement on everything, he said, perhaps a little overly optimistic there. And on President Biden, Putin was asked about the character of the man he sat across from during this summit today, given that story that Biden once told in a memoir, that he stared into Putin's eyes and told Putin that, I don't think you have a soul. Putin reportedly responding, saying, I think we understand one another. A reporter asking Putin about that a short time ago, and he didn't take the bait. Instead, he said of President Biden, he's very constructive, he's experienced, he's balanced. He talked about his family, that President Biden talked about his mother. And on his moral values, President Putin said of those values, it's quite attractive. Some powerful words from Putin in describing President Biden, and he said, we have to represent our countries. This is a very pragmatic relationship. I want to bring in our global affairs anchor, Martha Raddatz, as we await President Biden just moments from now. And Martha, you and I were both struck by this markedly different tone from Putin.
He clearly wanted to sound like a reasonable diplomat. He did not want Russia to look like the enemy. But I was struck, David, that we all have to remember that despite what agreements they may have come to, he never admitted those cyber attacks. He never said Russia was responsible for that. And he is an authoritarian leader. So in the end, we really do have to look for what kind of action he has taken, not just those words. But he started out by saying Americans view Russia as an enemy. He's clearly trying to change that and trying to sound reasonable, and he did. He had a much softer tone, but we have to remember who he really is.
And in fact, when Putin was pressed on these cyber attacks, and Americans at home know full well the impact, we saw it with the gas lines, we saw it with gas prices, some gas stations even shutting down the Colonial Pipeline, also the attack on the U.S. meat supply, believed to be Russian-based hackers. Putin turned that around during this press conference on the global stage, saying the U.S., Canada, Latin America, they all do the same thing?
Yeah, not Russia, not Russia. Cross out Russia, he basically said. It isn't our fault. But he did say they would continue to talk about it. It's also very encouraging on the prisoners, the American prisoners that are being held in Russia. He said they may be able to reach some kind of compromise on that. I can't imagine how happy the families are to hear that.
We're expecting President Biden to walk out just seconds from now, and we should point out that this is very different from what we saw in Helsinki in 2018. Both leaders appearing before the reporters on their own. President Biden.
I know it was easy getting into the pre-meeting. There was no problem getting through those doors, was it? Was there? Anyway, hello, everyone. Well, I've just finished the last meeting of this week's long trip, the U.S.-Russian summit. And I know there were a lot of hype around this meeting, but it's pretty straightforward to me, the meeting. One, there's no substitute, as those of you who have covered me for a while know, for face-to-face dialogue between leaders. None. And President Putin and I had share a unique responsibility to manage the relationship between two powerful and proud countries. A relationship that has to be stable and predictable. And we should be able to cooperate where it's in our mutual interest. And where we have differences, I want President Putin to understand why I say what I say and why I do what I do. And how we'll respond to specific kinds of actions that harm America's interest. Now, I told President Putin my agenda is not against Russia or anyone else. It's for the American people. Fighting COVID-19, rebuilding our economy, reestablishing relationships around the world with our allies and friends, and protecting the American people. That's my responsibility as president. I also told him that no president of the United States could keep faith with the American people if they did not speak out to defend our democratic values, to stand up for the universal and fundamental freedoms that all men and women have, in our view. That's just part of the DNA of our country. So human rights is going to always be on the table, I told them. It's not about just going after Russia when they violate human rights. It's about who we are. How could I be the President of the United States of America and not speak out against the violation of human rights? I told him that unlike other countries, including Russia, we're uniquely a product of an idea. You've heard me say this before again and again, but I'm going to keep saying it. What's that idea? We don't derive our rights from the government. We possess them because we're born, period. And we yield them to a government. And so the forum, I pointed out to him that that's why we're going to raise our concerns about cases like Alexei Navalny. I made it clear to President Putin that we'll continue to raise issues of fundamental human rights, because that's what we are. That's who we are. The idea is we hold these truths self-evident, that all men and women, we haven't lived up to it completely, but we've always widened the arc of commitment and included more and more people. And I raised the case of two wrongfully imprisoned American citizens, Paul Whelan and Trevor Reed. I also raised the ability of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty to operate and the importance of a free press and freedom of speech. I made it clear that we will not tolerate attempts to violate our democratic sovereignty or destabilize our democratic elections, and we would respond. The bottom line is, I told President Putin that we need to have some basic rules of the road that we can all abide by. I also said there are areas where there's a mutual interest for us to cooperate. For our people, Russian and American people, but also for the benefit of the world and the security of the world. One of those areas is strategic stability. You asked me many times, what was I going to discuss with Putin before I came? I told you I only negotiate with the individual, and now I can tell you what I was intending to do all along. And that is to discuss and raise the issue of strategic stability and try to set up a mechanism whereby we dealt with it. We discussed in detail the next steps our country should take on arms control measures, the steps we need to take to reduce the risk of unintended conflict. And I'm pleased that we agreed today to launch a bilateral strategic stability dialogue. Diplomatic speak for saying get our military experts and our diplomats together to work on a mechanism that can lead to control of new and dangerous and sophisticated weapons that are coming on the scene now, that reduce the times of response, that raise the prospects of accidental war. And we went into some detail of what those weapon systems were. Another area we spent a great deal of time on was cyber and cybersecurity. I talked about the proposition that certain critical infrastructure should be off limits to attack, period, by cyber or any other means. I gave them a list. If I'm not mistaken, I don't have it in front of me, 16 specific entities, 16 defined as critical infrastructure under U.S. policy, from the energy sector to our water systems. Of course, the principle is one thing. It has to be backed up by practice. Responsible countries need to take action against criminals who conduct ransomware activities on their territory. So we agreed to task experts in both our countries to work on specific understandings about what's off limits and to follow up on specific cases that originate in other countries, in either of our countries. There's a long list of other things we spent time on, from the urgent need to preserve and reopen the humanitarian corridors in Syria so that we can get food, just simple food and basic necessities, to people who are starving to death. How to build it and how it is in the interest of both Russia and the United States to ensure that Iran does not acquire nuclear weapons. We agreed to work together there because as much as Russia's interest is ours. And to how we can ensure the Arctic remains a region of cooperation rather than conflict. I caught part of President Putin's press conference, And he talked about the need for us to be able to have some kind of modus operandi where we dealt with making sure the Arctic was, in fact, a free zone. And to how we can each contribute to the shared effort of preventing the resurgence of terrorism in Afghanistan. It's very much in the interest of Russia not to have a resurgence of terrorism in Afghanistan. There are also areas that are more challenging. I communicated the United States' unwavering commitment to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. We agreed to pursue diplomacy related to the Minsk agreement. And I shared our concern about Belarus. He didn't disagree with what happened. He just has a different perspective of what to do about it. But I know you have a lot of questions, so let me close with this. It was important to meet in person, so there can be no mistake about or misrepresentations about what I wanted to communicate. I did what I came to do. Number one, identify areas of practical work our two countries can do to advance our mutual interest and also benefit the world. Two, communicate directly that the United States will respond to actions that impair our vital interest or those of our allies. And three, to clearly lay out our country's priorities and our values so we heard it straight from me. And I must tell you, the tone of the entire meetings, I guess it was a total of 4 hours, was good, positive. There wasn't any strident action taken. Where we disagreed, I disagreed, stated where it was. Where he disagreed, he stated. But it was not done in a hyperbolic atmosphere. That is too much of what's been going on. Over this last week, I believe, I hope, the United States has shown the world that we are back, standing with our allies. We rallied our fellow democracies to make concerted commitments to take on the biggest challenges our world faces. And now we've established a clear basis on how we intend to deal with Russia and the U.S.-Russian relationship. There's much more work ahead. I'm not suggesting that any of this is done. We've gotten a lot of business done on this trip. And before I take your questions, I want to say one last thing. Folks, look, this is about how we move from here. I listened to, again, a significant portion of what President Putin's press conference was. And as he pointed out, this is about practical, straightforward, no-nonsense decisions that we have to make or not make. We'll find out within the next 6 months to a year whether or not we actually have a strategic dialogue that matters. We'll find out whether we work to deal with everything from release of people in Russian prisons or not. We'll find out whether we have a cybersecurity arrangement that begins to bring some order. Because look, the countries that most are likely to be damaged, failure to do that, are the major countries. For example, when I talked about the pipeline that cyber hit for $5 million, that ransomware hit in the United States, I looked at him and I said, well, how would you feel if ransomware took on the pipelines from your oil fields? He said it would matter. This is not about just our self-interest. It's about a mutual self-interest. I'll take your questions, and as usual, folks, they gave me a list of the people I'm going to call on. So, Jonathan, Associated Press.
Thank you, sir. U.S. intelligence has said that Russia tried to interfere in the last two presidential elections and that Russia groups are behind hacks like SolarWinds and some of the ransomware attacks you just mentioned. Putin, in his news conference just now, accepted no responsibility for any misbehavior. Your predecessor opted not to demand that Putin stop these disruptions. So what is something that concrete, sir, that you achieved today to prevent that from happening again, and what were the consequences you threatened him?
Whether I stopped it from happening again, he knows I will take action, like we did when this last time out. What happened was we, in fact, made it clear that we were not going to continue to allow this to go on. The end result was we ended up withdrawing, they ended up withdrawing ambassadors. We closed down some of their facilities in the United States, et cetera. He knows there are consequences. And look, one of the consequences that I shouldn't say this, unfair of me. I suspect you may all think doesn't matter. But I'm confident matters to him, I'm confident matter to him and other world leaders of big nations. His credibility worldwide shrinks. Let's get this straight. How would it be if the United States were viewed by the rest of the world as interfering with the elections directly of other countries and everybody knew it? What would it be like if we engaged in activities that he is engaged in? It diminishes the standing of a country that is desperately trying to make sure it maintains its standing as a major world power. And so it's not just what I do, it's what the actions that other countries take, in this case Russia, that are contrary to international norms. It's the price they pay. They are not able to dictate what happens in the world. There are other nations of significant consequence, i.e. the United States of America being one of them.
Mr. President, just a quick follow on the same theme of consequences. You said just now that you spoke to him a lot about human rights. What did you say would happen if opposition leader Alexei Navalny dies?
I made it clear to him that I believe the consequences of that would be devastating for Russia. I'll go back to the same point. What do you think happens when he's saying it's not about hurting Navalny, all the stuff he says to rationalize the treatment of Navalny, and then he dies in prison? I pointed out to him that it matters a great deal when a country, in fact, and they asked me why I thought it was important to continue to have problems with the president of Syria. I said because there's a violation of international norm. It's called the Chemical Weapons Treaty. Can't be trusted. It's about trust. It's about their ability to influence other nations in a positive way. Look, would you like to trade our economy for Russia's economy? Would you like to trade? And by the way, we talked about trade. I don't have any problem with doing business with Russia as long as they do it based on international norms. It's in our interest to see the Russian people do well economically. I don't have a problem with that. But if they do not act according to international norms, then guess what? That only won't happen with us. It will not happen with other nations. And he kind of talked about that, didn't he, today? About how the need to reach out to other countries to invest in Russia. They won't, as long as they are convinced that, in fact, the violations, for example, the American businessman who was in house arrest, and I pointed out, you want to get American business to invest, let him go. Change the dynamic. Because American businessmen, we're ready to show up. They don't want to hang around in Moscow. Look, guys, I know we make foreign policy out to be this great, great skill that somehow is sort of like a secret code. All foreign policies is a logical extension of personal relationships. It's the way human nature functions. And understand, when you run a country that does not abide by international norms, and yet you need those international norms to be somehow managed so that you can participate in the benefits that flow from them, it hurts you. That's not a satisfying answer. Biden said he'd invade Russia. It's not, By the way, that was a joke. That's not true. But my generic point is, it is more complicated than that. David Sanger. I thought I just saw David. There he is.
Thank you, Mr. President. In the run-up to this discussion, there's been a lot of talk about the two countries spilling down into a Cold War. And I'm wondering if there was anything that you emerged from in the discussion that made you think that
With your permission, I'm going to take my coat off. The sun is hot.
Anything that would make you think that Mr. Putin has decided to move away from his fundamental role as a disruptor, particularly a disruptor of NATO and the United States. And if I could also just follow up on your description of how you gave him a list of critical infrastructure in the United States, did you lay out very clearly what it was that the penalty would be for interfering in that critical infrastructure? Did you leave that vague? Did he respond in any way to it?
Let me answer your first. Well, I'll answer your second question first. I pointed out to him we have significant cyber capability, and he knows it. He doesn't know exactly what it is, but it's significant. And if in fact they violate these basic norms, we will respond. Cyber. He knows in the cyber way. Number two, I think that the last thing he wants now is a Cold War. Without quoting him, which I don't think is appropriate, let me ask a rhetorical question. You got a multi-thousand-mile border with China. China is moving ahead, hell-bent on election, as they say, seeking to be the most powerful economy in the world, the largest, and the most powerful military in the world. You're in a situation where your economy is struggling. You need to move it in a more aggressive way than in terms of growing it. And I don't think he's looking for a Cold War with the United States. I don't think it's about as I said to him, I said, your generation and mine are about 10 years apart. This is not a kumbaya moment, as they used to say back in the 60s in the United States, like, let's hug and love each other. But it's clearly not in anybody's interest, your country's or mine, for us to be in a situation where we're in a new Cold War. And I truly believe he thinks that. He understands that. But that does not mean he's ready to, quote, figuratively speaking, lay down his arms and say, come on. He still, I believe, is concerned about being, quote, encircled. He still is concerned that we, in fact, are looking to take him down, et cetera. He still has those concerns. But I don't think they are the driving force as the kind of relationship he's looking for with the United States. Jennifer Jacobs.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. President. Is there a particular reason why the summit lasted only about 3 hours? We know you had maybe allotted 4 to 5 hours. Was there any reason it ran shorter? Also, President Putin said that there were no threats or scare tactics issued. Do you agree with that assessment, that there were no threats or scare tactics?
Yes.
And also, did you touch on Afghanistan and the safe withdrawal of troops?
Yes, and yes. Let me go back to the first part. The reason it didn't go longer is when the last time two heads of state have spent over 2 hours in direct conversation across the table, going into excruciating detail. You may know of time, I don't. I can't think of one. So we didn't need, as we got through when we brought in the larger group, our defense, our intelligence, and our foreign, my foreign minister wasn't foreign minister, my Secretary of State was with me the whole time. Our ambassador, et cetera, we brought everybody in. We had covered so much. And so there was a summary done by him and by me of what we covered. Lavrov and Blinken talked about what we had covered. We raised things that required more amplification or made sure we didn't have any misunderstandings. And so it was kind of after 2 hours there, we looked at each other like, okay, what next? What is going to happen next is we're going to be able to look back, look ahead in 3 to 6 months and say, did the things we agreed to sit down and try to work out, did it work? Are we closer to a major strategic stability talks and progress? Are we further along in terms of and go down the line? That's going to be the test. I'm not sitting here saying because the president and I agreed that we would do these things, that all of a sudden it's going to work. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is I think there's a genuine prospect to significantly improve the relations between our two countries without us giving up a single solitary thing based on principle and our values. No, there were no threats. There were, as a matter of fact, I heard he quoted my mom and quoted other people today. It was very, as we say, which will shock you coming from me, somewhat colloquial. And we talked about basic fundamental things. And you know how I am. I explain things based on personal basis. What happens if, for example. And so there were no threats, just There's simple assertions made and no, well, if you do that, then we'll do this, with anything I said. It was just letting him know where I stood, what I thought we could accomplish together, and what, in fact, if there were violations of American sovereignty, what we would do. No, he asked us about Afghanistan. He said that he hopes that we're able to maintain some peace and security, and I said that has a lot to do with you. He indicated that he was prepared to, quote, help on Afghanistan. I won't go into detail now, and help on Iran, and help on, and in return, we told him about what we wanted to do relative to bringing some stability and economic security, or physical security, to the people of Syria and Libya. So we had those discussions. Yamiche.
Thanks so much, Mr. President. Did you say that you didn't issue any threats? Were there any ultimatums made when it comes to ransomware? And how will you measure success, especially when it comes to these working groups on Russian meddling and on cybersecurity?
Well, it's going to be real easy. They either, for example, on cybersecurity, are we going to work out where they take action against the ransomware criminals on Russian territory? They didn't do it. I don't think they planned it in this case. And are they going to act? We'll find out. Will we commit? What can we commit to act in terms of anything affecting, violating international norms that negatively affects Russia? What are we going to agree to do? And so I think we have real opportunities to move. And I think that one of the things that I noticed when we had the larger meeting is that people who are very, very well informed started thinking, you know, this could be a real problem. What happens if that ransomware outfit were sitting in Florida or Maine and took action, as I said, on their single lifeline to their economy, oil? It'd be devastating. And they're like, you could see them kind of go, oh, we'd do that, but like, whoa. So it's in everybody's interest that these things be acted on. We'll see, though, what happens from these groups we put together. The third one, yes, go ahead.
Mr. President, when President Putin was questioned today about human rights, he said the reason why he's cracking down on opposition leaders is because he doesn't want something like January 6th to happen in Russia. And he also said he doesn't want to see groups formed like Black Lives Matter. What's your response to that, please?
My response is kind of what I communicated, that I think that's a ridiculous comparison. It's one thing for literally criminals to break through cordon, go into the Capitol, kill a police officer, and be held unaccountable. And it is for people objecting and marching on the Capitol and saying, you are not allowing me to speak freely. You are not allowing me to do A, B, C, or D. And so they're very different criteria. Steve Holland, Reuters.
President Putin said he was satisfied with the answer about your comment about him being a killer. Could you give us your side on this? What did you tell him?
He's satisfied. Why would I bring it up again?
And now that you've talked to him, do you believe you can trust him?
Look, this is not about trust. This is about self-interest and verification of self-interest. That's what it's about. So I virtually almost anyone that I would work out an agreement with that affected the American people's interest, I don't say, well, I trust you, no problem. Let's see what happens. You know, as that old expression goes, the proof of the pudding's in the eating. We're going to know shortly. Igor, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty.
Hello, Mr. President. Hello, Mr. President.
You want to go in the shade? You can't. Can you see?
Thank you. Yeah. All right. Yeah. So I think attacks in civil society and the free press continue inside Russia.
Yes.
For example, Radio Free Europe.
Yes.
Radio Liberty, Voice of America, Current Time TV channel where I work, branded foreign agents, and several other independent media. So we are essentially being forced out in Russia 30 years after President Yeltsin invited us in. My question is, after your talks with President Putin, how interested do you think he's in improving the media climate in Russia?
I wouldn't put it that way in terms of improving the climate. I would, in fact, put it in terms of how much interest does he have in burnishing Russia's reputation that is viewed as not being contrary to democratic principles and free speech. That's a judgment I cannot make. I don't know. But it's not because I think he's interested in changing the nature of a closed society or closed government's actions relative to what he thinks is the right of government to do what it does. It's a very different approach. You know, there's a couple of really good biographies. I told him I read most everything he's written and the speeches he's made, and I've read a couple of very good biographies, which many of you have as well. And I think I pointed out to him that Russia had an opportunity, that brief shining moment after Gorbachev and after things began to change drastically, to actually generate a democratic government. But what happened was it failed, and there was a great race among Russian intellectuals to determine what form of government would they choose and how would they choose it. And based on what I believe Mr. Putin decided was that Russia has always been a major international power when it's been totally united as a Russian state, not based on ideology, whether it was going back to Tsar and commissars straight through to the revolution, the Russian Revolution, and to where they are today. And I think that it's clear to me, and I've said it, that I think he decided that the way for Russia to be able to sustain itself as a great, quote, great power is to, in fact, unite the Russian people on just the strength of the government. The government controls, not necessarily ideologically, but the government. And I think that's the choice that was made. I think I'm not going to second guess whether it could have been fundamentally different, but I do think it does not lend itself to Russia maintaining itself as one of the great powers in the world.
Thank you, sir. Did military response ever come up in this conversation today? Did you, in terms of the red lines that you laid down, is military response an option for a ransomware attack? And President Putin had called you in his press conference an experienced person. You famously told him he didn't have a soul. Do you now have a deeper understanding of him after this meeting?
Thank you very much.
But on the military response, sir?
No, we didn't talk about military response.
In the spirit, Mr. President, you saying that there is no substitute for face-to-face dialogue, and also with what you said at NATO, that the biggest problems right now are Russia and China. You've spoken many times about how you have spent perhaps more time with President Xi than any other world leader. So is there going to become a time where you might call him, old friend to old friend, and ask him to open up China to the World Health Organization investigators who are trying to get to the bottom of COVID-19?
Let's get something straight. We know each other well. We're not old friends. It's just pure business.
So I guess my question would be, you've said that you were going to press China. You signed on to the G7 communique that said the G7 were calling on China to open up, to let the investigators in. But China basically says they don't want to be interfered with anymore. So what happens now?
The impact, the world's attitude toward China as it develops. China's trying very hard to project itself as a responsible and very, very forthcoming nation. that they are trying very hard to talk about how they're taking and helping the world in terms of COVID-19 and vaccines, and they're trying very hard. Look, certain things you don't have to explain to the people of the world. They see the results. Is China really actually trying to get to the bottom of this? One thing we did discuss, as I told you, in the EU and at the G7 and with NATO, what we should be doing, and what I'm going to make an effort to do, is rally the world to work on what is going to be the physical mechanism available to detect early on the next pandemic and have a mechanism by which we can respond to it and respond to it early. It's going to happen. It's going to happen, and we need to do that. Thank you.
President Biden in Geneva wrapping up his summit, stopping. Let's listen.
Families of the detained Americans came up and we discussed it. We're going to follow through with that discussion. I am not going to walk away on that issue.
Why are you so confident he'll change his behavior, Mr. President?
Yeah, I'm not confident in changing behavior. What do you do all the time? So when did I say I was confident?
You said in the next 6 months you'll be able to determine.
What I said was, let's get it straight. I said what will change their behavior is if the rest of the world reacts to them and it diminishes their standing in the world. I'm not confident of anything. I'm just stating the fact.
But given his past behavior has not changed, and in that press conference after sitting down with you for several hours, he denied any involvement in cyber attacks. He downplayed human rights abuses. He even refused to say Alexei Navalny's name. So how does that account to a constructive meeting as President Putin?
Right. You don't understand that. You're in your own business.
Is the summit with China next?
Who we need to load? Who we need to load? Quickly, let's go. Quickly, cool.
So there you have it, President Biden walking off the stage after taking questions, the solo press conference on the international stage following this historic, and you cannot understate the fact that this was a high-stakes summit here in Geneva with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Taking another question there at the end about trusting Putin. How can you be sure that he'll change? And he said, I'm not sure that he'll change. Remember what I said multiple times in my answers? President Biden saying, I said, if, and that they now will have to wait. He said 6 months with a number of these issues to get any indication if they're going to get any kind of change from Russia moving forward. He reiterated that this face-to-face dialogue was extremely important moving forward with U.S.-Russia relations, that they need a stable, a predictable relationship. These were words used by the president and the White House leading up to this summit. They talked about human rights. You heard him address Alexei Navalny there. He said at one point during this press conference that if he were to die, the consequences would be dire for Russia. But perhaps most importantly, in addition to being nuclear powers, he also talked about cyber. The cyber attacks that we have seen in the United States, both Western intelligence and U.S. intelligence agencies believing that they're the Russian government, the SolarWinds hack, the hack on federal government, several federal agencies, and on private U.S. companies, and most recently, the hacks on the Colonial Pipeline and the U.S. meat supply, affecting the meat supply, gas prices in the U.S., believed to be attacks based in Russia, ransomware attacks. He said he did press President Putin on this. We all heard Vladimir Putin this afternoon taking no responsibility for that. But behind the scenes, President Biden saying it was quite simple. We said to Putin, what would happen if we did this to you, essentially? He said these were not difficult questions to pose to Putin. We did it in very relatable terms. He said, what if someone in Florida or Maine was able to pull off this ransomware on your own oil pipelines? He said, of critical infrastructure, we have significant cyber capability. That Putin doesn't know exactly what that cyber capability is, but he knows, and we have it. That was as far as he would go as far as offering an ultimatum or a threat, though the president was very careful, Martha Raddatz, not to use those words in answering reporters here today. He said there were no explicit threats or ultimatums, but again, he said we have cyber capabilities too, and we made that very clear to Vladimir Putin.
And basically unrivaled cyber capabilities, and clearly he gave that message to Vladimir Putin, although without any threats, because he really didn't have to. And it seems that Vladimir Putin will keep denying that he did any cyber attacks, but he clearly got that message. I was fascinated by President Biden, how he approached Vladimir Putin. basically saying, if you want to get back on the world stage, it's more than a photo opportunity. You have to do something. And particularly with Paul Whelan, one of the Americans who is being held prisoner in Russia, he said he's a businessman. He was a businessman. If you want to attract business to Russia, let him go. So he's really appealing to that part of Vladimir Putin that wants to be more diplomatic, wants to be seen as a world leader, not just the authoritarian figure he is.
You're absolutely right, Martha. The President Biden, repeatedly going back to this point. How does the world view Russia? He believes that that's the way to get to Vladimir Putin on a number of these issues. He told Putin that the world can see what you're doing with these acts of aggression. I want to bring in our chief White House correspondent, Cecilia Vega. And Cecilia, he made it very clear. He said that this is not a kumbaya moment. There's no love in the room. There's no one reaching out for a hug. But that he made it clear to Putin that if you continue to act and behave this way, there will be consequences.
He said, David, there's more work to do ahead. That is exactly right. And I got to tell you, just reading the president there, I was just a couple of rows in, he was bothered by these questions on the back end, one from me, one from my CNN colleague, Caitlin Collins, when it came to these personal relationships. He was leaving the microphone, the podium, and he came back over when he heard that question about how can you be so confident that he can be trusted, saying that I don't believe that he can be trusted. This isn't about trust. You'll remember he came into this verify, then trust. He was bothered when I asked him if he'd learned any more about his personality and a better understanding of Vladimir Putin at the end of this 2-hour-plus meeting, because you'll remember he had famously looked at him and told him that he had no soul. Those were not the questions that he wanted to talk about, David. I just want to recap really quickly an important point here. The president did answer my question when I asked if military response was on the table if there was another cyber attack, and he said we did not talk about that in there today.
Again, no explicit threats. And Cecilia, also, I took note that he didn't have a problem bringing up that Putin had talked in his press conference about Biden's character, the fact that Biden had brought up his mother, that this was a talk about family, that there were very personal terms in that room. But on the reverse, Biden was unwilling to go there. I think I heard Cecilia say, I'm sorry if you're talking to me. Perhaps she can't hear us. Cecilia, can you hear us? We'll come back to Cecilia in just a moment. The motorcade probably falling through. I'm just picking up bits and pieces in my ear. Perhaps that's why the signal went down. I want to bring in our chief Washington correspondent, Jonathan Karl, watching this along with us all day today. And John, you were the one covering the previous president, President Trump, a very different summit in 2018 in Helsinki. That summit ending with a dual press conference, both leaders on the stage together. Very different what we witnessed here today.
Very different. Donald Trump seemed to want to appeal to Vladimir Putin, admired Vladimir Putin in some ways, wanted to emulate Vladimir Putin. But the message from Putin was the same today as it was back in Helsinki. I mean, he denied everything. He denied any involvement in the cyber hacks that we have seen coming from Russia. He denied that he was quelling political dissent, said that these were foreign, basically foreign instruments that he was, people like Navalny. But David, the bottom line is that Putin interfered in the 2016 election, interfered in the 2020 election against Joe Biden, invaded Crimea, has had cyber attacks on the United States emanating from his country, and has largely gotten away with it. Now we heard from Joe Biden saying that Putin does not want another Cold War. It's clear that Biden doesn't want another Cold War either.
That's an extraordinary point you make, John Karl. Again, these are two leaders sitting across from one another, and U.S. intelligence believes one leader tried to affect the election. It didn't work out the way Putin wanted. He now sits across from President Biden on the world stage, and instead of the previous president, I want to get back to Cecilia Vega. Cecilia, we were on the air together a moment ago, and I was picking up a few words that you said. I'm guessing that the Secret Service, the motorcade going by, knocked out your signal for a moment. But the question I wanted to ask you, you had mentioned that Biden did not want to talk about Putin and on personal terms, and whether or not he saw more of the leader as a man sitting face to face. On the reverse side, President Biden, I took note, was willing to talk about what Putin had said about him personally, that he brought up his mother, his family, that there was a connection of some sort in that room, a very basic connection.
A very basic connection, David, but the president repeatedly said this was not a kumbaya moment. In fact, I think he said along the lines of, we're not friends. But this is President Biden, who has been on the world stage for a very long time, given his 26 years in the Senate on the Foreign Relations Committee. He has met Vladimir Putin before. He is no stranger to foreign policy. And he said this up there today. His goal in this was to have a face-to-face dialogue, that he firmly believes that the foundation of this relationship with Russia right now, though it may be at rock bottom, at a potentially all-time low, both sides agree on that. The president saying now that they have had this face-to-face conversation, they've got these working groups now meeting on these crucial issues facing both countries, they believe this is a step in the right direction. As he said, David, though, more to come.
No question about that, Cecilia. In fact, he said 6 months from now, perhaps even longer than that, we'll know. The proof is in the pudding. He gave us many of his sayings, one of them right there, whether or not Putin acts on any of these things he's now promised to act on, including the cyber attacks. The president repeatedly said there were no specific ultimatums, no, if you do this, I'll do that. These were basic, fundamental things. And again, he spoke to Putin on terms that the president believes Putin would understand. What if these ransomware attacks that we've seen in the U.S. were to start happening in Russia? And again, said we have significant cyber capability. I want to bring in Terry Moran now, who was in the room in Helsinki in 2018 with these two leaders, former President Trump and Putin. Former President Trump choosing Putin, saying, I believe him. When he denied meddling over his own U.S. intelligence teams today. As Cecilia has just pointed out, President Biden was very careful and very direct to say there is not a personal relationship here with this leader of Russia.
Absolutely, David. And in fact, the president went on to say, almost scoldingly, the press was looking for these personal relationships. He says, this isn't about trust. It's about verification and self-interest. Let's see what happens. Now, that's a kind of throwback to an older kind of world leader interaction between Washington and Moscow. Trust but verify, of course, is what Ronald Reagan said, quoting a Russian proverb. And what Joe Biden is saying is, I know who this guy is. I've known him from decades, but we've got to do business. So they reestablished the ambassadors. He put down a line. It was pretty clear on cyber. He said, we will respond if there are cyber attacks. And he knows what those are that are beyond the pale in a cyber way. So he essentially issued a veiled threat. But in contrast to what President Trump did in Helsinki, which was excruciating for the people in the room, President Trump's own top aide on Russia saying she thought about faking a medical emergency to call a stop to the whole thing. President Trump did openly trust President Putin, one of the world's most notorious peddlers of disinformation and lies. He said, well, I don't know why I should believe him, as opposed to his own American intelligence agencies. This was very different. This was a much more business-like approach, a traditional approach, which is, let's see what happens. Here's what I've got to say. Here's what he's got to say. This isn't about trust. It's about self-interest and verification.
Terry Moran watching the coverage of this summit right here along with us this afternoon. As we mentioned on human rights, President Biden said we will not shy away from this. He said it's what we stand for as America, that we haven't reached perfection on that, but we continue to work on that ourselves. And so he did bring up Alexei Navalny in this summit with Vladimir Putin. We heard Mr. Putin questioned about this. He wouldn't even use Navalny's name, which he never does. It was not a surprise on the world stage, but it was our own Rachel Scott in that room. Most of the reporters today, Russian, though she was one of few American journalists in that room. And she asked Vladimir Putin about the opposition and why so many members of the opposition, those who have gained traction, have ended up poisoned or killed. Here was the question.
Mr. President, thank you so much for taking my question. President Biden has said that he would respond if cyber attacks from Russia do not stop. I'm curious, what did he tell you? Did he make any threats? And a quick follow-up, if I may, sir. The list of your political opponents who are dead, imprisoned, or jailed is long. Alexei Navalny's organization calls for free and fair elections, an end to corruption. But Russia has outlawed that organization, calling it extremist. And you have now prevented anyone who supports him to run for office. So my question is, Mr. President, what are you so afraid of?
The United States has adopted a law in accordance with which the U.S. has said that they will support various political organizations in Russia. At the same time, they made an announcement that the Russian Federation is an enemy. They've spoken publicly, saying that they will restrain the development of Russia. Here's a question. What organizations, what political organizations of the United States and other members of the Western community, which organizations should be supported in Russia, especially if they're paying for them. We're just like the Americans back, the way the Americans did back in the 1930s. We're calling them foreign agents. But it's not prohibited. They're not prohibited from working. They can continue to operate. Foreign agents don't need to stop operating. If they are extremist in nature, then that's another issue. The organization that you mentioned has publicly called for mass disorder. They have publicly called for breaking the law. They called for minors to participate in activities that were against the law. And they were talking about using Molotov cocktails against the authorities as well, including against police. America just recently had very severe events after well-known events after a killing of an African American. And an entire movement developed known as Black Lives Matter. I'm not going to comment on that, but here's what I do want to say. What we saw was disorder, destruction, violations of the law, etc. We feel sympathy for the United States of America, but we don't want that to happen on our territory. And we're doing our utmost in order to not allow it to happen. And some fears that has nothing to do with anything. Please. Could you give me the microphone, please?
You didn't answer my question, sir. If all of your political opponents are dead, in prison, poisoned, doesn't that send a message that you do not want a fair political fight?
As for who is killing whom or throwing whom in jail, people came to the U.S. Congress with political demands. 400 people. Over 400 people had criminal charges placed on them. They face prison sentences of up to 20, maybe even 25 years. They're being called domestic terrorists. They're being accused of a number of other crimes. 70 of them were arrested right away after the events, and 30 of them are still under arrest. It's unclear on what grounds. And as for nobody from the official authorities has informed us about it. Some people died, and one of the people that died, they were simply shot on the spot by the police, although they were not threatening the police with any weapons. In many countries, the same thing happens in our country. I'd like to stress once more that we sympathize with what happened in the United States, but we have no desire to allow the same thing to happen in our country.
President Vladimir Putin responding to our own Rachel Scott this afternoon and talking about Alexei Navalny and opposition in his country. He made the comparison to January 6th and what we saw in the Capitol attack. And Rachel, you and I were watching as President Biden just moments ago called this a ridiculous comparison.
A ridiculous comparison, an outrageous comparison. President Biden saying, he says it's one thing to compare and one thing for an insurrection to happen. It's another thing for a leader to compare that to a country that is not supportive of free and fair elections. You heard from President Putin there really taking no responsibility for any of that, even after I followed up for the second time. He tried to turn the tables, bring up January 6th, bring up Black Lives Matter. The bottom line here, David, this does not change the political equation here. You still have Alexei Navalny. He is in prison. His organization that supports free and fair elections, that is outlawed now. And President Putin just signed something into law that says people that support that organization will be sent to jail. They cannot run for office. So the question still remains, what is he so afraid of?
The politics in Russia. Rachel Scott asking Putin the tough question this afternoon. I want to get to Mary Bruce, our senior White House correspondent, for the politics in our own country back home. Reaction already coming in from Republicans on the Hill, Mary?
Yeah, we're getting some reaction from the president's Republican critic, Senator Lindsey Graham, of course, a close ally of former President Trump, says he found it very disturbing to hear President Biden suggest that Putin would lose standing on the global stage if he doesn't stop these cyber attacks, stop meddling in elections, saying it's clear to me Putin could care less. And Putin has shown no sign of changing his behavior. We heard him say today that he wants a constructive relationship. He wants our countries to work together. But Putin was also defiant in the face of these accusations against him. Now, Biden says he made clear that there will be consequences if he continues these behaviors. But so far, the administration's response to Putin hasn't been enough to deter his actions. David.
Mary Bruce at the White House. Mary, our thanks to you. And that takes me to our Chief Justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas. Already some critique coming in about whether or not President Biden was tough enough on Vladimir Putin when it comes to these cyber attacks in America.
David, the stakes are high and they're getting higher. Make no mistake about it. That cyber attack on Colonial Pipelines just a few weeks ago hit Americans where they live. It affected them directly. And U.S. intelligence officials today are not that impressed with what Putin had to say. He had a who us attitude in terms of pointing to other countries and not to what Russia specifically is doing, David. And the bottom line is this. With Biden giving him those 16 entities, including the water supply and electrical grid, he's saying, do not attack those or we will respond. The question is, what is Putin going to do about it? David?
You're absolutely right, Pierre. He did not take any responsibility, Vladimir Putin, for the cyber attacks. A final thought now from Martha Raddatz. You heard it from the president multiple times. The proof is in what we see in the months ahead, something Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, told you.
Exactly. He said it will take time. We will not know this right away. We won't know this right away. It may be weeks. It may be months. It may be much longer than that. But Joe Biden said today he did what he came to do. David.
Martha Raddatz with us here in Geneva. Our thanks to you and to the incredible team here on the ground in Geneva covering this summit and the team back in Washington with us all day long here. Our thanks to them. Our coverage will continue on ABC News Live and at abcnews.com. And, of course, the entire team right here with me for World News Tonight. I'll see you a little later. Good day.
This has been a special report from ABC News.